Is this really the wedding dress of Princess Charlotte, daughter of George IV and Caroline of Brunswick? In this royal fashion documentary from History Calling, we'll study the gown known as Princess Charlotte's wedding dress and find out if it deserves that title. We'll look at what we know of its story, from the creation of the original garment all the way down to the present day, compare what we see now to descriptions and an image of it from the time of Charlotte's 1816 marriage to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and find out what conservationists discovered when they examined it in detail in the 20th and 21st centuries. Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales was born on the 7th of January 1796 at Carlton House in London. Her parents were the Prince and Princess of Wales, though her father would later become Prince Regent and eventually George IV, and they were horribly mismatched. In fact, their marriage imploded pretty much as soon as it began, and had Charlotte not been a wedding night baby, or possibly conceived the morning after, they may well have failed to procreate. Such was their hatred for one another. There was therefore no happy family life for the little princess, who grew up as a pawn between her mother and father. But crucially, there were also no little brothers to displace her from the succession. Instead, she was the second in line to the throne of her grandfather, George III, with only her own father ahead of her, making her the most important little girl in the land. In 1813, her father had her become engaged to William, Prince of Orange. However, she created quite the stir when she called off this engagement in early 1814, having discovered that she would be expected to live in Holland if the marriage went ahead. Here you can see a satirical image showing her playing with the prince like a toy in reference to her treatment of him. Instead, she went on to become engaged to the 25-year-old Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, with the wedding set for the 2nd of May, 1816. Now we come to the wedding dress. This was created for Charlotte by a London-based dressmaker known only as Mrs. Triud of Bolton Street, and according to an article in the newspaper The Morning Post, published on the day of the wedding, it was completed 3 weeks ahead of schedule, then sent to the Prince Regent's home at Carlton House, where the wedding would take place. It was described in minute detail in the newspapers published in the days after the wedding, and it is the Morning Post's description from the 3rd of May 1816 which I am going to use here. It said, "The wedding dress, composed of a most magnificent silver lama on net," lama was a strip of silver or silver gilt, "over a rich silver tissue slip with a superb border of silver lama embroidery at the bottom, forming shells and bouquets. Above the border a most elegant foiling, tastefully designed, in festoons of rich silver lama, and finished with a very brilliant rouleau of lama." I think this means a rouleau, which is an ornamental band. "The body and sleeves to correspond, trimmed with most beautiful Brussels point lace, in a peculiarly elegant style, etc. The manteau, which was the train of the dress, of rich silver tissue, lined with white satin, trimmed round with a most superb silver lama border in shells, to correspond with the dress, and fastened in front with a most brilliant and tasteful ornament of diamonds. The whole of the dress surpassed all conception, particularly in the brilliancy and richness of its effect. Headdress, a wreath of rosebuds and leaves composed of the most superb brilliants," meaning gemstones. By looking at some other newspapers, we can glean a few extra details. The Niles Weekly Register, published all the way over in Baltimore, showing that royal weddings were big international news even 2 centuries ago, told its readers that the manteau was 2.5 yards long, and that as well as the rosebuds and leaves headdress made of brilliants, Charlotte wore, quote, "a necklace of a single row of large brilliants of the finest lustre, with large drop earrings to correspond, and a brilliant cestus, which is a bridal belt or girdle, of great value." Clearly, the whole ensemble had cost a fortune, and the dress was a work of art. But what happened to it next? Well, tragically, Princess Charlotte died the following year, a few hours after giving birth to a stillborn son. Her dress, which had surely remained in her ownership up until that point, was presumably given by her widower to her former dresser, Mrs. Louisa Lewis, because she left it, in her will of 1838, to Lady Gardiner, the wife of Prince Leopold's equerry. She didn't give a very detailed description of it, though, saying, "I also give and bequeath to Lady Gardiner, the wife of Sir Robert Gardiner, a silver tissue dress," and then there's a word which is unclear, "with silver net worn by Her late Royal Highness the Princess Charlotte on her marriage." After this, it disappeared for 90 years. Then, in 1927, it was loaned to the London Museum by George V, whose wife, Mary of Teck, had it in her possession. We have no idea of its provenance during those lost decades, although it obviously worked its way back into royal ownership at some point. Lady Gardiner retired from the court of Charlotte's cousin, Queen Victoria, in 1859 and died in 1876, so maybe one of those dates marked the return of the dress to the then Queen. Since 1927, the dress has been displayed on numerous occasions, including at Lancaster House in the 1930s, Kensington Palace during the 1950s and 60s, and the Museum of London in 1972. It went on display again in 1981 to mark the marriage of the then Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, was at the Museum of London in 1997, and was most recently on public view in the Queen's Gallery in Buckingham Palace in 2023, which is where I saw it. So let's take an in-depth look at it now and find out how much of it really dates to 1816. Just before I do that though, please do remember to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that you never miss an upload. You can also find me over on Instagram, where I post at least once a week, and on Patreon, where I provide bonus material including early access to ad-free videos and mini podcasts. This week, for instance, I'll be sharing the fate of Charlotte's husband, Prince Leopold, with my upper-level patrons. Thank you to everyone who already supports me on that platform, as well as those of you who make one-off donations to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. The Royal Collection, which now cares for the dress, describes it in its current state as silk satin overlaid with 3 layers of cream lace net with metal llama embroidery, the high-waisted bodice with short puffed sleeves and dipping neckline, underskirt, overskirt, train and apron. We have only one picture of the dress from 1816, which is not, and probably wasn't intended to be, 100% accurate, as the artist likely didn't see the dress in person. Unlike today, there wasn't a press presence at royal weddings. However, by juxtaposing it with modern photographs, comparing 19th and 21st century descriptions, and reading the work of conservators who have handled and examined the gown, we can see how much it has changed. One such conservator and dress historian is Kay Stanaland, who was involved in presenting the dress at the 1997 exhibition. Stanaland writes in an article which I'll leave details of below that one of the big changes is the addition of the apron section over the front of the dress's skirt. There is no mention of this in 1816, it does not appear in the original picture, and it was not a common design detail during the period. There are other telltale signs that something is amiss too. On the skirt, the embroidered net contains different designs, and much of the ornamental detail, such as the presence of bouquets, is missing or different from contemporary descriptions. In fact, upon closer examination of the fabrics and hemlines, it was obvious to the conservators that the entire garment had been dismantled and put back together again, but not from the same parts. In other words, what we have today is a mishmash of dresses, and very little of it appears to come from Charlotte's wedding gown. For as Stanaland says, once you discount the train and the skirt from this empire-waisted, short-sleeved dress, there's not much left. Instead, quote, most of the ensemble was originally a court dress, almost certainly once used by Princess Charlotte, to which has been added a few relics of her original wedding dress. That is, the shell-ornamented borders on bodice, sleeves and apron-like front section, and the rouleau on the latter. Following Stanland's lead, the Royal Collection's website also admits that most of what we see today is not part of the original garment, saying that, although associated with Princess Charlotte, the skirts and train may not be original to the ensemble. The best view we'll ever get of the original dress is the 1816 drawing, even with its inaccuracies. The attachment of the train to the shoulders is incorrect, for instance. But why would Charlotte's dress be so dramatically altered so soon after her big day? The answer is that the people of the past were a lot more financially invested in their clothing than many of us are now. There was no such thing as fast fashion in the 1810s, not even for the royal family. Garments were expensive and labour-intensive to create, and all the more so when the items were as richly decorated and of the kind of quality that Charlotte's wedding dress undoubtedly was. It literally cost a fortune. Unlike in the 21st century, it was standard practice to mend and upcycle garments to suit new tastes, fashions and body sizes until no further use could be had from them, and that even extended to wedding dresses. Nowadays, these tend to get one use, then spend the rest of their existence in a wardrobe, despite being one of the most expensive pieces of clothing most women will ever buy. But our ancestors weren't so sentimental. Far from being a sign of disrespect, taking clothing apart and reusing it showed the importance the owner placed on the workmanship and materials that had gone into it, and their desire to avoid being wasteful. This is why you see so few garments from this era and earlier in their original state. They were literally pulled apart at the seams and their fabrics and decorations used again on fresh items. It isn't surprising at all that Charlotte did the same thing with her wedding gown, and I actually think that we today could really learn something from this mindset. I can tell you that I have certainly noticed a decline in the quality of the clothes I buy, and this is from what are meant to be decent stores, over the past 10 to 15 years. And items I used to get, like cotton t-shirts, which would have comfortably lasted me for 5 years, are now made of much thinner material with wonky stitching and falling apart after 18 months. Meanwhile, we still have the suit that my grandfather wore to his wedding in 1949, and many other times too, and while it's musty now, it's still holding together very well. Current throwaway attitudes to clothing are really a very modern phenomena that has only emerged in the last couple of generations. My grandfather, who was born at the tail end of World War I, was still asking in the 1990s if that suit could be altered so that he could continue wearing it. His attitude to clothing was very much waste not, want not, and until quite recently, he would have been in the majority. His aunt, who actually wasn't that much older than him, only died in the early 2000s, but I remember when other family members were clearing out her house, them saying that she would still have worn clothing she made herself back in the 70s because she knew the quality was there, and as a seamstress she was able to mend and modify it when necessary. Two of my own aunts who got married in the 1970s cut down and or dyed their dresses afterwards and reused them. So even people very much alive today, plus our more recent ancestors, would be horrified at our prevailing attitudes to clothing. They looked at what they put on their backs in much the same way we view fine jewellery or designer handbags. We'll get jewellery fixed, stones reset, and handbags professionally mended. That's the type of attitude people used to have to clothing. So that's the story of Princess Charlotte's wedding dress and of why the surviving garment contains so little of the original gown, though it's still a beautiful example of a Regency era dress, even if it is a composite. Question of the day. Have you noticed the quality of the clothing you buy changing over the past few years? And do you think we should strive to go back to the way our ancestors thought about garments and try to reuse them as much as possible? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and for more fashion history, try one of these options next. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.